Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to our latest live BSIA broadcast. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Tom Ford, the Membership Development Manager at the BSIA. And for the next 40 minutes, we're going to be focusing on vacant property protection and the security industry's obligations during and post-COVID-19. So today, we're joined by Gideon Reichenthal, Commercial Sales Manager of Clearway Environmental Services, and also Chairman of our VPP section, and also Rob Dakin, Head of Business Resilience Management Delivery at AXA Insurance, who both very kindly agreed to join us today and give us their expert overviews of the issues surrounding today's subject. So after hearing from our panelists, we're going to be opening the floor to questions, which you can start to send in now for me to line up after our discussion. It should be no longer than 20 minutes or so. So you can open this discussion as well during the debate in the chat option to the right, and we'll be releasing a recording of this and a write-up of the broadcast after the event. So before we start, I'd like our speakers to introduce themselves and give a brief overview of their specialism and a very short opening statement. So Gideon, if I could start with you, please.
Thank you, Tom. My name's Gideon Reichenthal, and I've worked in the vacant property protection arena now for almost 16 years, and also spent 6 of those years as a part of the BSIA, and in my capacity as chairman for this section, and looking to develop best practices in vacant property protection. And we've worked on projects such as the development of the British standard BSA 584 for vacant property protection. And today is all about looking at how COVID has affected our industry sector and how we've responded to that and the impact it's had. And happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Then Rob, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Hi, I'm Rob Dakin. I'm Head of Business Resilience at AXA. AXA is probably a name that you know, not least of all sponsorship of Liverpool FC, which not everybody in AXA necessarily agrees with, but there you go. It's from a point of view of AXA, we're kind of largest global commercial insurer and a very large kind of insurance player in the UK market. We're particularly large in the kind of real estate market. Therefore, we've always had, probably it's fair to say, a passion for vacant property and how we protect it. And my background with AXA started in 2001, so I've been in the risk control, risk management division for AXA all of that time, which we've rebranded as Business Resilience, as it's more appropriate to what we do for our customers. But insurers are like elephants, you never forget, and it doesn't take too many very large losses and incidents to create a strategy around how you deal with it. So historically, when insurers were looking at just turning services off, weekly inspections and timber boarding over windows, AXA probably was the leading insurer back in the early noughties to deliver a better, more sort of focused service around vacant buildings. And for that reason, obviously, I'm delighted to be on the BSI committee call today, hoping to answer some questions from members.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you both for opening statements there. It leads me nicely onto my first question of today's broadcast, which inevitably is around COVID-19 and the effect that this has had on empty property in general. So we take the situation of the last 9 months almost with a pinch of salt now in our general working and daily lives. But how has the pandemic affected and impacted the VPP arena from an industry perspective? So what's been the impact?
I'll take that, Tom. I think the initial impact of COVID was really in the ways that we changed our working environment. So with so many people working from home, the normal working environments, town centres, industrial areas were really very quiet, and the whole risk, the whole manner of the risk had changed from these areas being busy to being quiet, allowing more activity to occur that was unobserved. So there was greater risk to industrial property, office properties, and because of the way that COVID had come upon us, and I think it to some extent it took people by surprise in that they hadn't fully anticipated what the impact would be. So buildings were left in a way that meant that there was lots of stock inside buildings and so forth. So the effect of COVID was initially was very jarring, and now in the second COVID, I think people are starting to understand better the impact and the risks, and are taking steps in order to address those issues. And whilst we've seen a lot of changes because of COVID in our working practices, we've obviously had to be more careful about how we work with others. We are, we are still operating quite, in terms of the levels of work, it's still very normal. And I think we've yet to see the full impact of COVID and the outcomes following this long period of lockdown.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Gideon. So that's an industry perspective then. So what's the general overview of how this has affected insurance across the sector then, Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I kind of agree also with what Gideon's saying there, in that maybe the worst from a vacant building perspective is yet to come. I think I just want to pull it back slightly in the sense of the policy cover. I'm not getting too techie on policy cover and details, but for those, we have to make quite a distinction between properties that have become, well, were vacant for a short period at the start of kind of lockdown, and those that have obviously long-term unoccupied. So the short-term, as you may be aware, obviously in this space, that insurers will provide sort of full insurance cover for a duration for sort of temporary vacancy. And it's similar in household, but for commercial industrial premises, it's typically 30 days of full cover before you need to notify the insurer that you've become unoccupied. And that's an interesting one, because obviously from a resource point of view for insurers, and also doing the right thing by our customers, it was a question of what do we do at that 30-day period? Are we going to be inundated with customers telling us that they're vacant and taking action? Or was the right thing actually for us to do is to extend that? So I think in the market, and again today, I don't particularly want to talk exclusively for AXA, and I can give a market view of where I'm aware of it. I think typically in the market, we were looking at insurers extending that period to sometimes 60, sometimes 90 days to deal with that kind of period to provide the full cover. I think insurers obviously had a deep concern over that point, that even for those that didn't employ any kind of vacant building protection services per se, and were sort of reliant on their building security, obviously with regard to fixed permanent alarm systems, one of the questions we had was, well, if the police are going to be dealing with other issues, congregation of people, etc., are they likely to go onto an industrial estate to try and protect a property? I think by and large that passed as far as insurance is concerned without too many difficulties. I think, as Gideon said, just to repeat that in some respects, once we get into scenarios of the economic shock of the pandemic, maybe when we get into sort of Q1 next year, maybe to Q2, then I think the concern will be that there'll be a rise in number of vacant buildings. And the strategy that obviously we would have for vacant buildings as to what level of protection is required would obviously kick in at that point. But also trying to support customers, because insurers, a real estate insurer, we have large portfolio customers, many properties, and we will continue to insure those vacant buildings. So it'll be a challenging time, I think, next year.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Okay, appreciate that, Rob. Cheers. So that leads me on nicely, I guess, to the next question then. So what does the security industry, who's responsible for an increase in empty property? What do they need to consider in terms of its public liability then, Rob?
Well, from public liability, I suppose it's a question of whether you are a company who are involved in protecting that building, or as an owner of the building for public liability. So just make that distinction for me.
Yeah, so I'd probably say from the organisation first, and then maybe we can look at it from both sides, I guess.
From the organisation, as in the those who are protecting the property?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we would look at is for all the companies that are out there who deal with properties that are vacant from a security point of view. It's, you know, we so try and avoid too much conversation around the legal requirements, etc. But from a health and safety point of view, but certainly for sort of public liability and property owners' liability, which is an area that we would look at as well. For the companies that are protecting them, I think we find some quite difficult buildings that are going to come out of this. In that, a building that's nice and secure, is inspected frequently, has got alarm protection, has got a kind of an exterior kind of perimeter of the building that's protected and in good condition. I think that's one thing. It's when you get into buildings that are potentially derelict, it's a larger site, unlit, about how the companies that protect those buildings, how they manage that risk, and also looking at kind of competent advice. So it falls into the kind of health and safety domain. It's how do you competently assess those risks and how they are approached the customer, because I think the market is around services that are delivered and recommendations given, and how do you tell a customer that you've given good advice to, and to actually then looking to actively deal with those things that have been addressed for them.
Right. Yeah, no, brilliant. Thanks. So can I ask Gideon then? So following on from that answer, so how does that affect the VPP section in terms of these sort of I don't know, obligations, I guess?
I think we're largely, I would say we're largely driven by the insurance industry and what we do. I mean, they set the gold standard as far as what their clients need to achieve in order to secure their properties. But we're always looking to go above and beyond in order to ensure that it doesn't come to the point. We want to deter somebody from going into one of our customers' properties. We would rather they didn't break in or attempt to or go onto the site at all, if that's possible. But in terms of what we touched on, in terms of what COVID's doing, is it's changing some of those dynamics. So whereas properties that wouldn't normally have been at risk, that were in industrial estates, suddenly those industrial estates are quite quiet at night because the businesses aren't operating at full capacity because of some of them are locked down or shut down. And I think we touched on just in our in our earlier conversation before we started about the some of the things like raves and how they how they are have become predominant, and obviously with the lockdown going on into December, and possibly venues such as nightclubs and so forth being shut down, people who own those type of buildings need to consider what they can do in order to prevent. And obviously the vacant members of the BSIA and in particular the Vacant Property Protection section are there to help our clients to understand the risk and how they can, what measures they can take to protect their buildings. So we're not just looking to make them compliant, but actually help them to prevent the risk from occurring at all. So, but certainly COVID has probably increased the level of properties that are now at risk because of the fact that the landscape is so much different, quieter, and therefore allowing much more to go on without it being observed or detected.
That's a fair point. No, thank you very much. Rob, just quickly, just before I move on to another question, did you cover everything that you wanted to from that side?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking from an owner's point of view as well, and the situation, I guess, from our point of view is if you have an insurer kind of involved and active in it, it may depend on the cover that's provided. So sometimes cover is restricted to base levels of things like fire, and it's a question of whether the public liability is always covered. But the way that the buildings are typically protected to protect against forced entry and crime will go some way, obviously, towards kind of compliance, if that's the right word, for the public liability side of things. I think we obviously make a distinction with things like the Occupiers Liability Act, and looking at buildings and the site, and whilst you think perimeter fencing of a degree and signage might be enough, you need to look at the environment as to whether that's appropriate. And we do see in certain circumstances higher levels of security be put on the building to really prevent that access. So we talk about industrial estates, but even whilst, for example, at the moment the schools are mostly open, it's those that are taking a shortcut through the industrial estate and see a building, and if it's in an innocent way of a football being kicked over the fence and going to retrieve it, versus someone actually thinking for urban explorer or other kind of circumstances where you might want to get onto site, security to try and prevent against theft and crime, obviously it kind of crosses over into that. So there are some of the other considerations that we might have, just trying to look at how we would deal with those really. From our point of view, what I didn't mention earlier was that we have a team of surveyors or business resilience managers actually are out on site. So we see a vast number of our properties where we're not actually restricted because of COVID, and we've had to do things in lots of different ways over the past few months to try and engage with customers as best we can. But whilst we're able to get out on site, we will have our eyes on that as well, and we might then look at some different circumstances. So whilst we'll take the recommendations of the companies in the space, obviously we'll have our own view of how buildings should be protected.
Great. No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's good to get it from all these different sides. Gideon, you okay with everything now?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to what Rob's said there, and some of these pieces we're talking about, it's interesting to there are many new innovations in terms of the technology space that help detect and deter, beyond the physical, in terms of electronic security, whether that be CCTV towers and video verified detection systems, and just those type of technologies, which have now become, because of advances in technology, they've become more and more applicable in the vacant property space, where previously there hadn't been availability of power and such like. Those systems have now been developed so that they can run in those spaces without any power or whatever on site, and can be utilized. So a combination of technology, good old-fashioned concrete barriers, Harris fencing, and and inspections, patrols have meant that we have a much greater ability to monitor and manage high-risk sites.
Just come back on that point as well, Kid, if that's okay, because that's absolutely right. And I think when we look back at how we've dealt with vacant buildings over the years, I remember being a surveyor for AXA and before, where the building has been completely boarded over, it's absolutely pitch black, the insurers ask for all the services off. How could you safely inspect that building? And obviously that applies to anybody that looks to break in as well. Floorboards missing, everything else, and obviously that's where you had the perforated screens, and where maybe electronic security has taken over in some respects, depending on the environment. So all these different kind of pick and mix options are really, really important. But the internal protection obviously is as important as the external. So while we want to make sure the building is not vulnerable to easy access once you're inside, and I guess one thing that's close to our hearts is incidents of kind of unauthorized access to buildings for fly tipping purposes, and then sort of turning into a squatting environment, and then loading the building up with fly tipping for several days. And AXA, sadly, as have other insurers, some very large incidents like that. And obviously with the BSIA and so on, we're taking action to try and deal with that. But in those sort of circumstances, if you're in the building and all those legitimate or illegitimate reasons why they might be in, if the building is in a dangerous kind of state internally as well as externally, these are other considerations that we would have. And I guess it depends on the nature of the building as to what the plans are for it for the future. If it's something that's derelict, the likelihood is it's not going to get much insurance cover at all for that these days. But might be restricted just to the clearance of debris if the place then is finally destroyed. But if they're planning for reoccupancy as soon as possible, then clearly they want to keep the building in the best condition possible for early rental or for sale.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Rob, because this actually leads us quite nicely into another question that I've got, and it's interesting to get these perspectives from both sides here. So my question then, I'm going to start with Gideon then. So tell me, what is the industry doing around the issues regarding things like fly tipping, illegal occupation, and with some of the new issues which have arisen during lockdown, such as the rise in illegal raves and gatherings. So how is this going to impact on companies then? So what's the industry doing, and what's the impact going to be, Gideon?
Well, clearly one of the, I mean, even with COVID in full force, we saw a lot of activity, as previously mentioned, raves, as I maybe alluded to earlier. Young people, young people are need to vent their energies, and I'll say that in the nicest possible way. And with venues closed down and still remaining closed down, they will be looking for places to go and party effectively. And the only places that they can do that in the cold and the wet winter is empty, vacant industrial units. And I think a subject or point that we touched on earlier is the fact that whilst there, to an extent, the police can respond to those, they are illegal as large gatherings in the COVID situation. Nevertheless, the police are a very, very stretched resource. Even in normal circumstances, we've found it, very difficult in terms of getting a response to a site that's had any sort of illegal activity on. To get a response when the police are facing threats from terrorism and the normal crime, and then on top of that now the addition of having to police large gatherings as well with COVID has meant that they're incredibly stressed. So businesses have to consider the fact that the private sector, they'll have to look to the private sector to provide the services they require to secure their properties. Now, whether that's a large industrial unit or a retail shop in the high street, it basically boils down to the same thing. If they're expecting in this current environment for law enforcement to respond to all of that, that's going to be quite challenging. And for companies like ours who work tirelessly in the vacant property protection marketplace, we're ready and waiting to support those people, support those public services by providing the measures, whether it's temporary alarm systems, whether it's regular inspections, or physical security, whether that, at the end of the day, the steel security screen. And we have, we've been working consistently from the beginning of the first lockdown till now, providing those services to our clients in very difficult circumstances.
All right, thank you, Gideon. So if I could just ask you then, Rob, touching back on what you commented on previously and on Gideon's remarks too. So how does this impact from an insurance perspective then? What do companies need to take into account if we're looking at illegal gatherings and in general?
Good question. So I've had a few thoughts about what Gideon's been talking, because it's quite easy for an insurer to go, well, we will look at loss potential, so frequency and severity, key things that we work towards. So that we see and always have done, I guess always will do. We've seen some degree of occupation of occupied premises onto car parks temporarily over weekends or whatever, a little bit of waste, but a fly tipping, whatever, and you can't necessarily deal with everything. Where we're talking about entry into a vacant site already and then setting up some degree of camp or using that building for fly tipping, we work with obviously our partners on that, but we also, as I said before, we do thousands of inspections a year ourselves for our customers, and on those sort of circumstances, concrete has made a big comeback. So, we want to make sure that we want any vehicles away from the building, away from the site. So, I live in the Midlands, quite close to motorways. You see the big industrial estates off the motorways, and there's some really very large logistic warehouses that are vacant, and they're rich pickings. I mean, they're rich pickings for fly tipping, not only for the car park, but also get into the building. Those are shutters behind you. Suddenly you're a squatter, and the police aren't going to touch you for 5 days until the civil order comes through. Despite the fact there may be a regular convoy of waste coming to the building, it's suddenly no longer a political matter, and that's a concern to us. There's the damage to the building, it's theft from the building at that time as well. So whether they're stripping it for copper, cable and pipe work, we see it all. And one of our biggest strategic moves, I guess, is to try and keep vehicles away from the building. The further they are away from the building, the less likely they are to try and enter. So we've used all the technology and some really sophisticated smart CCTV systems, together with obviously the guarding, the guards with dogs. That can be highly effective if it's deployed correctly. And the big sort of 4.5-ton concrete blocks across entrance points, any access to the buildings and sites to keep them away. They're not going to want to lug all of this waste across a car park to get it into the building. So it's a wry smile to me when I drive past industrial estates with huge great bollards outside. And it's not the retractable bollards that are cut out quite easily with a circular saw. It's very, very heavy concrete blocks.
Great. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that from everyone. So some pretty good insight, actually. I found it really useful. Hopefully the viewers have as well. Some good advice along the way as well. So I've got some questions from our audience. So I'm gonna start with you, Rob, actually, seeing as you're still there. So give me a moment. I'm going to try and find it. So this is from Lewis Fordham from Orbis. So this is for you, Rob. So how has this period had an impact on insurance claims and premiums?
Oh, good question. I was trying to look at the chat myself then, and I might have just made an error. Hang on, there we go. should not look at that. Well, I mean, I'm sure you've all have the your violins out and pulling on the heartstrings here to say that insurers don't make any profit right now. COVID has been a very heavy year for insurers in lots of different ways, positive in some and hard in others with regard to things like the business interruption claims, which obviously has made a lot of press, but obviously with other circumstances going on. And it's remarkable to think what a normal good year of profit looks like compared to what people actually think. So that's another factor. So again, I think as we perhaps said before, it's going to take a little while to kind of get fleshed out as to how this reacts. We're an insurance company. We pay claims. That's what we're here for. And we obviously, from my side, as sort of business resilience, what we try to do is manage that risk and mitigate it, because there can be, in certain occasions, the iceberg effect, in that there's only a small amount of it that you see, lots of stuff going underneath, which maybe sometimes is the uninsured part or the long-term consequences of these sorts of things. So I think for us, it's about maintaining our relationships with our kind of key customers to make sure that we're there for them when they need us. And of course, we have an ability to be on site and actually answer customers' questions directly. So yeah, it's going to take a while to know what the outcomes are, but we are entering what's known in the industry as a hard market, which means actually over the past year or so, some insurers have kind of left this particular space, not particularly vacant, but around sort of commercial property and property owners, and that naturally has that curve with any market of supply and demand. We have added into that supply and demand element potential for very large and significant claims. So ours is different to most in that sense, but it'll be a period to watch, and certainly not a period where premiums are becoming more competitive, shall we say.
Okay. Right, I've got another couple of questions actually. Thank you, Rob, for that. So Gideon, I'm going to put this question to you. This is a bit of a mouthful, so bear with me. That's okay. So, as we all use VPP tech solutions to provide the client with the security they require, if the response service is not in place, does this mean any advantages of technical systems are no better than the building being empty?
What is the question? If you have technology but no response, is that the question?
Yes. So if we have tech solutions to provide the client with the security they require, if the response service is not in place, does that mean any advantages of technical systems are no better than the building being empty?
Well, I think it's been demonstrated for a long time that if you, for example, have CCTV systems and there's no response, eventually crime levels where they're initially placed, crime levels will return to the normal levels in those areas. I mean, obviously, any system, if it's not responded to when a crime is detected, then eventually those people who are doing whatever they're doing, whether it's breaking into fly tip or to remove copper or whatever their objective, they will, if they feel they can operate with impunity, they will. So it doesn't matter what type of system you have, your systems have to be backed up at the end of the day. So even if it's just a weekly inspection to check that the property, the integrity of the property is such that it's there's no signs of a breach or anything. So it's something as simple as that, maybe all that's required. But I don't think it matters whether it's a high-tech solution or a low-tech solution. If an event occurs and there's no response, then I think your property is going to suffer as a result.
Yeah. Okay. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to put another question to you, Gideon. That question was from Sam, by the way. Sam Noble. All right, Sam. It's been a while. But this question I'm going to ask you as well. So, has there been a change in the types of illegal occupations due to COVID? Has there been a change in behaviour due to restrictions, do you think, overall?
Well, initially, I think in lockdown 1, I think there was essentially a complete sort of shutdown of all services. So there were no bailiff services. But I think now, even though the people have a recourse to these services, if you have to follow a legal route, the courts are very busy. So clearly that's going to have an impact. And if the courts are processing a lot of cases, and they seem to have, from the evidence from the news reports would suggest that they are heavily backlogged, then if your case it gets pushed back, it can go on for quite a long time. So you could have a long-term problem without any real legal recourse if you get squatters breaking in. That said, to the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I would suggest that the best approach would be to look at ways of preventing those problems. You can't obviously stop people from breaking in. And again, as we mentioned earlier, we've yet to see the full blowback from the sustained lockdown period, and as people's furloughs end, and we've already seen reports of people made homeless. That's going to place people in difficult and desperate situations. So property will be more vulnerable from people looking for places unfortunately looking for places to live, whether that's rough sleepers, squatters, or whatever. So again, the problem is probably going to it's going to become a bigger problem before it dies down.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Rob, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Because I'm going to ask one more question before I bring it to an end after this.
Probably no. I think I'll be okay with that. Actually, I kind of agree with Gideon. So,
okay.
Last question.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to ask then. So, the cost of removing, if we use sort of squatters for an example, so the cost of that removing is massive. So, if there isn't a removal as soon as they enter the building, then how key is having the resources to deal with them within the site boundary? Sorry.
Who's that to then? Tom?
Rob, to you.
Just remind me of that question again. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah,
clear with the question.
There's a little bit to that one. Just so the cost of removing squatters is huge. So if they're not removed as soon as they enter the building, how key is having the resources to deal with them within the site boundary?
So, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, not talking about pots of money, but if it's a higher level of on-site presence to try and avoid the possibility of squatting, versus trying to deal with the consequences of it, it's that classic thing that Gideon's kind of said about prevention versus the consequences of that. And we had quite an interesting example recently of a very large building in the centre of London, and you'd have to put security guards inside the building. There was no perimeter right out onto the road. So how would you deal with that? And looking at CCTV, also the same. You'd be putting it out onto the street, which obviously is problematic as well. So you end up something internal. And we see lots of examples of where squatters have come in. We don't necessarily hear about it immediately because it depends on who's involved in it, and it may become that it becomes a claim. You have to act as far as your insurance policy is concerned, as if you're not insured, take all reasonable precautions to prevent loss. So, if it's got to go through due process, I think as Gideon was saying, if the courts are busy and these things may take a little bit longer, we're in the business of trying to make a risk tolerable. We pay claims. We wouldn't exist if we didn't pay claims. Is it an excessive claim? Do we feel that actually further action could have been taken? I think it's a really difficult one to kind of pin down on because some sites, if you've got a perimeter and you've got that protection, then again we would actively work towards that. But there has to be a value between, from our point of view, and it goes back to this initial point around the frequency and severity. So if you've got a high severity risk, and if it becomes a very large site, we would expect quite a large level of security to be placed on it. If you talk about it in kind of pure sums insured kind of terms, what we insure the building for, once you get into the millions of pounds, then we're probably expecting quite a high level of security to protect that perimeter, to protect the access to it. But there's so many factors that are involved in it, including the actual the building itself, its environment, its location, its access, its attraction to others. Again, as part of risk assessment that we would see or that we would deliver ourselves, we'll kind of wrap all that into it.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. So, Gideon, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I think it's interesting. Time is an interesting component of security, and it's been touched on in many different ways. But how quickly you respond to an event, whatever that event be, whether it's you've detected something on your CCTV or someone's breached a gate, but all of those and how you deal with that, and the timeliness of how you deal with that. So whether you have a security presence on site to deal with that straight away. But one of the things I think people underestimate is the amount of damage, I think is probably the best word for it, that can happen. So if we talk about fly tipping, I'm still shocked. If you've got we touched on industrial space, but if you've got hard standing, which lends itself to bringing vehicles in, the amount of waste, and I'm sure Rob has plenty of claims examples, but the tonnage is enormous, and you sometimes wonder where all this waste is coming from, and it is staggering, the amount, the cost that some of these and the resulting, and I don't know whether, I mean, Rob could probably put some context to this. I don't know how many companies actually claim on some of these bigger incidents because of the implications of those claims, but they must have serious financial implications for the businesses involved. But so arguably, whilst the security costs for protecting an industrial site that may run to many thousands, the cost to resolve clearing hundreds and hundreds of tons of waste, I'm sure runs beyond the hundreds of thousands, maybe into seven figures. I'm sure that's not uncommon, and I've certainly witnessed what can happen in a space as little as 5 days. So especially in this time, with the restrictions, with people operating in the way that they're operating around COVID and limited availability of services because of COVID, they're going to look for shortcuts, and so it's in the interest of people who own site properties that they consider whether it's squatting or raves or fly tipping, what measures. I mean, it can sometimes boil down to just having a decent lock and chain on a gate, and you'd be surprised how many sites have not done that, just made a simple, because they've been operating normally up until COVID. So it's a case of just have a review and cast an eye over your present security, because it might not be fit for purpose now that you're working in a limited fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Rob.
The only thing I would add is you're quite right that actually some fly tipping incidents can hit seven figures in terms of cost as cleanup. Certainly when it's gone into the building, we've seen kind of 2 meter high stacks of waste. I think even things like the farming community have suffered. It's a barn that's available for short-term rent, the cash in hand for the farmer, and it looks like it's all wrapped bales, but actually inside it is all waste. So some of those claims are absolutely horrific. It might depend on their policy cover in terms of damage or cleanup costs. But yes, on some of our customers, we've seen what we've paid, and other insurers have as well. So the seven-figure values for them.
Wow, it really makes you think. I actually do have a few more questions, but I'm very conscious of time, so I'm actually going to call it there. What I will say is, in the days leading up, in the next few days, we will follow up and get answers to all of the questions from our panelists today. Thank you for those questions, and I really appreciate the responses as well, which I know we have not answered all of them, but we will get back to you after the broadcast. And before I go, I want to thank the panelists as well today. It's actually been really interesting to hear from two different sides about a common issue, and I'd really appreciate you taking the time to take part. I hope to get to speak to you again soon and follow up with another broadcast in the new year. But thank you once again, and I'll speak to you all again soon.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you.